Okay, thank you so much for the introduction. And yeah, in the interest of time, let me start. I should just say that that the discussed paper is is an article, not a PhD. So what I'm presenting today is part of is some excerpts what actually I'm trying to for my PhD, which I'm trying to develop into a chapter, and so let me go ahead. So selling food, feeding the city, Muslim restaurants in Mumbai. I should say that unfortunately I don't have pictures for you. I'm always conflicted because of anonymity and if some sensitive political situations in India. It's better sometimes to keep things more anonymous. So selling food, feeding the city, Sufi food ethics. So Sufi food ethics, ingredients, and the body. One evening, after a meeting with Arshad Bhai, the owner of the famous Taj Mahal restaurant in Dongri, Mumbai, I visited Uncle, a regular informant of mine, at his perfume store. Uncle, as I usually addressed him, is an elderly man in his early 60s. He was a regular discussant of mine, always eager to hear of my research adventures. He was familiar with my interest in Muslim food practices and that I was conducting research at both Taj Mahal and Bukhara restaurants. So I've just kind of given these names, pseudonyms. Both have well-established reputations. Recounting my meeting that morning provoked a response from him. With the shake of his head, Uncle advised me not to go there since it was just business. He's speaking specifically because I had just been at Taj Mahal. So this is just business. Bukhara restaurant, in contrast, was Sufi food and thus a better choice. I was intrigued by his judgment, wherein the adjective Sufi, usually reserved, venerated, or ridiculed as a form of Islamic devotion and practice, was here an adjective for the quality of food. Uncle is a conscious follower of the Deobandi school, who is well versed in basic theological discourse and legal debates. He often warned me jokingly on Thursday evenings that I should avoid the nearby dargah, as it is a place of distraction, not prayer, where all kinds of strange things happen. Right? Ajib cheese. Now, however, his categorization did not refer to questions of sectarian orientation, but rather indexed a moral economy of food, quality, and business integrity. He continued to explain that the Sufi food, as he called it, at Bukhara, referred to the integrity of the owner and the quality and taste of the food, given the balance, and here I use an English word, the balance in the amount of masala and oil used in preparation. Taj Mahal, in contrast, as just business, was a restaurant of somewhat dubious reputation, according to him, that used excessive amounts of chili in food preparation. For Uncle, masala, spices, as a source of taste, fragrance, right, medicinal value, that is fedaman for the body, with bodily benefit, which he can compare to green chili, a cheap everyday ingredient widely understood in South Asia as the preserve of the amateur cook. So the categorization of Sufi and business further indexed the quality, cost, and medicinal effects of masala as compared to green chili. At Bukhara, the quality of the masala used in preparation was evidence of the taste, the fragrance, and integrity of the owners, but also their willingness to forego profits in lieu of a superior service and a superior product. So Uncle's categorization of public food signals the intersection of integrity, quality, and profit in the moral economy for food in the old Muslim quarters of Mumbai. Um, so the religious categorization of Sufi, often linked, often associated in Islamic discourse with integrity, simplicity, and care, intersects with masala as a source of taste and medicinal value and trading profits, and as a source of taste, medicinal value, and then trading profits as the legitimate aim of business activity, but one which is always at risk of devolving into selfishness and greed. So there's this kind of I'm trying to establish this, that there's a question of integrity, personal integrity, there's a question of the quality, and there's a question of business practice and the risk inherent in profit making. So his utterance reveals the significance of a moral economy of food in a city that since its founding, Mumbai, has been marked by spectacles of economic growth and wealth alongside inequality and poverty. and also a place where, as scholars have argued, the topography of Islam has often been concerned with the plight of the urban poor. If the texture of life in Mumbai is very often a tussle between fortune and poverty, then the narrative and material practices of these two restaurants constitute a complex Islamic moral economy of care and aspiration. And that's what I'm hoping to show you. So the next section I titled Capital and Care, situating Bukhara in the religious and political geography of Mumbai. The Muslim-dominated market areas at the center of my ethnographic work are of historical significance in the colonial formation of Mumbai. The Manichean urban colonial geography of the colonial city designated and demarcated spaces for natives and Europeans. The colonial town that begins at the fringe of this area, it's about 2 kilometers south of where I'm speaking about, is marked by wide boulevards and Victorian architecture. In the colonial town, the colonial state imposed European standards of planning and infrastructure development that includes sewers, accessible roads, and piped water. In contrast, the native town that begins with the market areas of Crawford Market, Muhammad Ali Road, Dongri, and onwards, are cramped, congested, and for much of the city's history, sites of infrastructural neglect. Only with the cholera pandemic of 1896 that affected both native elites and English elites, so the elites got affected by this massive divides in the city, that the political will for a proper sewage and water system was developed. And here it was not necessarily riots, but it was the risk of contamination that disease could spread, between classes in close proximity. So some kind of system was developed, but even then it remained rudimentary. In the late 19th and early 20th century, the native areas of Mumbai, the native town, became synonymous with crowding, congestion, and ill repute, or at least stigmatized. The colonial state, as expected, was concerned about the depraved and congested native quarters and the dangers of crowds and congestion as portents of anti-colonial sentiment, which dovetailed with scenes of infrastructural neglect, such as open sewers and stagnant water. Yet, in Mumbai, native squalor existed alongside spectacles of native capital. Bombay is a city that also, already since the 18th century, attracted Indian merchants and traders, including Muslims of Gujarati origin, like Memons and Boras, but also of Konkani origin from further down the coast, as well as Parsi, Jain, and Hindu traders. Given the infrastructural neglect by colonial authorities, the civic infrastructure of the native town was very often provided by native capital. Chawls were constructed for the thousands of laborers in the famous native-owned cotton mills, and water, educational, and religious infrastructures constructed by different communities for their own constituents. Now, historians have argued for a distinction between native philanthropy as the expenditure of donations on public infrastructure for the common good. So you had rich, wealthy businessmen, hospitals, sometimes other kinds of basically public infrastructure, schools, water was very common. So the idea, they argue that philanthropy was like a public good for everybody, while charity as a communal project was usually targeted only at the specific community. So where Memons would build for their own, the Boras for their own people, right? So there's ethnic charity organizations. So on the one hand, you have that charity as a communal project created a kind of a communal urban topography with different neighborhoods known for different communities and different infrastructure reserved for these communities. But at the same time, what the historians are saying is that the intimacy and dense urban topography of Mumbai means that it's not an enclave space at both elite and lower levels, because of this kind of very, very density. So you'd find slums next to high-rise buildings, very elite streets, just behind them kind of chawls and working class neighborhoods. So at the same time, while you have this enclaves, you also have a lot of mixing. And so Bombay also becomes known as for cosmopolitan interactions across all kinds. And okay, so sorry, I'm just realizing. Okay, so basically the point is that you have yeah, you have charity, you have philanthropy that is building the city, that is building the infrastructure of the city. There is a communal element to this, but there's also a lot of mixing because of the density of the city, and religious festivals such as Muharram are attracting Muslims and Hindus across the religious and ethnic divides, and so are other kinds of events, right? Much often to the fear of the colonial state. So the reason I track this here is I'll argue that the history of Mumbai, or Bombay at that time before it was renamed, can be thought of a story of capital and care. As a gateway to the Indian Ocean and the primary city of British trade, Bombay both attracted and produced vast fortunes. And the city continues to be a place of aspiration, an embodiment of social mobility and overnight fortune. But at the same time, it is marked by these histories of philanthropy, charity, um, and specifically, as Niall Green has shown, a kind of a religious topography which thinks about the urban poor. So it's in this context of capital and care that Bukhara and Taj Mahal restaurants emerged in the moral economy of the city. So in case you were wondering, why did I go so far back? So the founders of both restaurants stem from lower caste communities of poor rural UP, Uttar Pradesh, a very large province in the north of India, migrating to Mumbai in the late 1920s. They entered a city in the midst of political agitation and the mass migration of rural poor away from rural distress. Now, for those excluded from formal labor employment in the factories and mills, which is usually reserved for the working class, employment was difficult to come by. Now, as Jan Bremen has pointed out, in places like Mumbai, where at some point in the 90s, he suggested that up to 90% of employment was technically informal, right? To speak about working class is actually to speak of very small, but he talks about footloose labor. So in general, you're talking about single male migration to the city, whether they have formal employment or work in the informal economy in various ways, housed in cramped single rooms in tenements or slums, often lots of men staying together without basic amenities, without necessarily fully equipped kitchens. So in this context, food was, of course, an opportunity, right? And you'll see in the story when I get to it, it was an opportunity if you fail to get the employment in the mills, in the formal employment, and are unable to make it, making food on the street side and selling to the passing trade became a potential for opportunity, a way of earning a livelihood. And importantly, I also want to say in the contemporary, where Muslims are stigmatized as disgusting, as other by this right-wing discourse, it is still the food industry, the meat industry that remains one small, very important source of employment and livelihood. So in this context of footloose labor, of urban poor, of the working class, and the need for food, Uncle's explanation about the beneficial properties of food is key to the precarity of bodies, right, in working class, congested, unsanitary native towns.
Just a reminder, Dr. Tayob, you've got less than 5 minutes, please.
Okay. All right. So the founder of Bukhara, so these are these two restaurants, Bukhara and Taj Mahal. So what I want to argue is that they speak about a moral economy of necessity and aspiration. And you'll see that the link between these two. So Bukhara restaurant was founded by somebody they call him Haji Sahib. He founded this restaurant in 1957 after 30 years in Mumbai. I recounted these stories. I collected them from his son and his grandson, and also the people that work there, and some of the people in the restaurant, and what I picked up in the neighborhood. And what happened with him, the way the narrative goes, is that he was from a very poor rural area. His father died when he was 8 years old. He was then forced to kind of look after the family in a very hagiographical way. They say his first work was he was helping to construct the local mosque in the area, which was a success. Then he went on to train under an ustad, a master cook, somewhere in his area. But interestingly, they also say that he was working at the British military encampment outside Bareilly making rotis. So this is something I still need to explore, because there's something about roti making which is not necessarily a very esteemed a profession in terms of cooking. But in 1933, he decides to come to Bombay, right? So he comes to Mumbai, And there's not much detail I could get about what happens, but the story goes that he's a really good cook. He's a lot of integrity, and so he very quickly makes it in the city. Right? He quickly manages to establish a small little place, make some biryani, sell it on the street, and before you know it, within 10 to the next 20 years, he becomes very successful. So he's got the family is telling me he owned 6 to 7 stores all over the native town, and these are like small little stores specializing. The one was specifically, they mentioned a milk shop, where they make lassi and they sell milk, and then the other ones were more these kind of foods. In 1954, he is visiting. He's in the north near Bareilly, in the north of the country, and he's going for the urs of his sheikh, and he falls in love. Divana ho gaya. So he decides he wants to become a murid of the sheikh. So he leaves his family behind and he stays there for 3 years. So during this time, he basically is he's going through this, and at some point in 1957, his peer tells him, "Now you're ready to go. You have to go back." And so that's the story of the founding of this restaurant. He comes back and comes with this idea, with a number of key ideas, that basically we have to provide good food that is faydaman, that is beneficial and good for the body, for the ordinary person. He has also, according to the story and what you picked up, he was also known as a hakim, right? He's not a trained hakim in Unani medicine, but he picked this up, his love for learning. They mentioned that he used to read a lot. He was a kind of quite a maverick. He would
kindly, Dr. Tayob, summarize in 1 minute, please.
But I only started at 50p. Okay. Um, so I'll just give you these quotes just to get a sense, right? So the first one, he would tell his children, we are Muslims, and he narrates this to a hadith. We have to see for our neighbor. If he's hungry, we have to feed him, right? No matter who he is, rich or poor, Hindu or Muslim. So there's this kind of universal idea that they claim. The idea of the hakim, that he puts good masala, good quality ingredients in his food, doesn't skim, doesn't use bad oil, uses ghee. So the quality of the ingredient must come through in the taste and in the body of the people that eat it. He also had this idea that he would never upgrade the restaurant. So at some point in the 70s, they were very successful, and people were saying, make it fancy, make an AC, air-conditioned section, etc. And he said, no, and this is another quote they attribute to him, if we sell such expensive food that we do not sell to the poor, then how will we show our face to God, right? How will you show it? So there's an element of shame. There's an ethics of shame that you have to keep it, keep things simple. Now, of course, the point of bringing in the moral economy is that they became incredibly wealthy, right? So it's kind of like doing well by doing good, right? So they became wealthy. They're selling food at a low markup in the city. And the last practice was that they eat the food all the time. And I was hoping to expand on that, but I think I'm very close to the end. So they eat this food, and it's part of a critique of corporate development. And and so just to wrap up, the other restaurant I'll tell you about is one where there's much more emphasis on innovation. There's still a religious background. There's still this idea they were very poor. They used to cook at the shrine in a particular place in the north. They would make mithai over there at the shrine, and the idea was they got this blessing. They came to Mumbai. They started on the footpath. But here it's the idea of aspiration, that they became big. And he does a lot of innovations and creativity. He has people like M.F. Hussain, the famous artist, who has drawn in his place. And there's this kind of aspirational quality of the old Muslim town. But at the same time, even though he's aspiring and he's talking about creation, innovation, and success, he's always also referring to the poor that come there and where they started. And so I'm kind of, sorry, I had to rush this through, but that's what I'm thinking about, these two modes. And what this tells us is that we have to think about against the idea of the Islamic or the idea of the moral economy as homogeneous, but rather to look at close attention to the different kinds of calibrations of ethics, religion, and the materiality of food, which I was trying to hopefully.
Thank you.